Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our lecture on World War II by turning our attention back to the war in Europe. Last we discussed the war in Europe, we saw that Hitler had managed to take over pretty much all of Europe. He has pushed his way to all the way west to the border of neutral Spain. He's pushed his forces east, splitting Poland with the Soviet Union. Also remind you of the non-aggression pact that those two countries have at this time. Today's lecture, that pact will be violated. But we saw that the Battle of Britain, I think, was the last point that we made regarding Europe, and we saw that they were able to defend their turf by claiming superiority of the air with the Battle of Britain. We will work to the end of the war in Europe, and a reminder that the war in the Pacific is raging at the exact same time. I've chosen to kind of focus on these areas individually instead of kind of bouncing back and forth between Europe and Pacific. So I'm going to tell you the rest of the story really from 1941 through the end of the war in Europe, and then we will end the war in the Pacific with our next lecture. I want to draw your attention to the picture in the background. The picture that you see behind me is a picture from D-Day, and this was one of the transports that brought thousands of men to the shores of France. We're going to talk about the invasion. The invasion won't take place until 1944, so there's going to be about 3-4 years that Adolf Hitler has full reign of Europe and is clamping down. This is really when the Holocaust really ramps up its efforts in exterminating excuse me, those targeted groups. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me get the lecture pulled up so you guys can see the PowerPoint. Boom. All right. So the first thing that we are going to discuss today is something that I have been alluding to since the very beginning of the war, and that is this non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany will come to an end in June 1941. Remember, we studied both men, Hitler and Stalin, and we saw how really paranoid both men were. I think today, they easily would have been diagnosed with different psychological issues. But paranoia is the driving factor here that leads to this next event. So, on this graphic, what we're about to describe is what's called Operation Barbarossa, and it is one of the largest land invasions in history. We are going to see literally millions of men are going to be thrown into a fight against the Soviet Union. In 1941, this is when it occurs. So understand that this is really a kind of a turning of the tide where the Soviet Union, once they're betrayed by Germany, they will join the Allied fight, and they will be the recipient of many U.S. supplies from this point on. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So you can see that yellow line there in Eastern Europe. That's kind of where the original line was drawn between the Soviet Union and Germany. And you can see the various phases of Operation Barbarossa for the second half of the year. Notice when they are getting into Russia, all right? It is, although they're able to successfully, within a month, take over a lot of Eastern Europe, man, Russia really puts on this the strong front and really starts bogging them down. This is we're going to see a lot of what's called scorched earth policy. But notice that they're getting into the heart of Russia when it's starting to become winter time. And I've given you guys a lot of advice. If you ever become a leader of a nation, number one, do not invade Afghanistan. It will not work out. The other advice I would give you is don't invade Russia in the winter time. It didn't work out for Napoleon. It did not work out for Hitler here. So this is the first event that I want to talk about in our notes, but I always like starting with a map to see exactly where we are discussing. So let's go ahead and get. All right, here we go. So on to the notes. So Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. The most important thing to remember that Operation Barbarossa was the failed German invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, the failed German invasion of the Soviet Union. So not only did this betrayal of the Soviet Union end their non-aggression pact, I should mention the reasoning. You might question, why would Germany even risk this? Well, frankly, they were needing, one thing we have not talked about is the Hitler's policy of Lebensraum. Sorry, my German's not very good, but Lebensraum, which roughly translates as living space. Part of Hitler's reasoning early on in the war and annexing places like Poland and to the south was to have more living room for people of German descent. And if you want to make life better for Germans, you want them working less, then frankly, you need other people doing those jobs. So part of the reasoning here for Operation Barbarossa is frankly to gain slave labor. It's weird that we would be mentioning that in the 1930s here, but part of what they're doing is the fact that they see the Russians, the Slav ethnic people, as being lower on that. If you had to rank in terms of superiority, Germans at the top, and Slavs are lower on that list. So they are literally invading Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union partially to gain slave labor. They also were gaining resources. They're having to find more food, but also other resources that are more prevalent in Eastern Europe. Oil is a big deal as well. So another part of their reasoning. The impact, as I said, this was one of, if not, this might be the largest invasion force that in world history. I believe that's very much the case. 3 million men are going to be invading the Soviet Union. And as I said, I think that is the largest invading force in all of recorded history. So this is a major operation that is taking place. There will be major casualties from this as well. 1 million Germans will die in this. So a third, 1 out of every 3 Germans that take part in this will die in this invasion. For the Soviet Union, the casualty rate is extremely high. They will lose 5 million people in this. One thing I don't think we focus on enough in the story of World War II is the Soviet loss of life. All told, the Soviet Union, in 4 years of fighting, they are going to lose 26 million people. This 100% starts to help shape their mentality after the war. And, our next unit's going to be over the Cold War. We're going to take a look at, why the Soviets were so anti-West. And, I think a big part of it is they feel betrayed during this war, that they're having to face the brunt of the German onslaught. Now, realistically, logistically, what could the West have done differently? I don't know. But understand that they're going to end this war thinking that they have, in a lot of ways, sacrificed more than any other nation. And in some ways, that's absolutely correct, especially by loss of life. 26 million people. Guys, we lost about 1 million people in the Civil War, if memory serves me correctly, and we were killing each other. That's our largest loss of life. This is 26 times more than that. So just a tremendous sacrifice and just a needless loss of life during this point. And as I said, another major impact that I would record in your notes is that the Soviet Union would join the Allied side here in 1941 as a result of this betrayal. Well, let's move on to what's happening elsewhere. In North Africa, we have not talked about North Africa as much as kind of a minor theater of war here. The Italians had invaded Ethiopia. We talked about that at the very beginning. But there's been kind of a combined force at this point in the story. The Germans have really taken hold of North Africa. And this is actually going to be the first area that we see Americans invade. D-Day is not the first invasion of Europe. We're going to talk about us coming in to North Africa, and then up to the north. You can see that map at the top illustrating some of that. But the North African campaign, at first the British forces that had kind of controlled North Africa, they are going to be forced out by one of the one of the strongest of German generals, Erwin Rommel. That's a person you definitely need to know, Rommel, Rommel, and he is known as the Desert Fox. The Battle of El Alamein, which I believe is on your vocab terms, but ELALAMEIN, the Battle of El Alamein. That was a 12-day battle between the British and the Germans, where the Germans were able to force the British basically back. The U.S. would follow up by invading North Africa. They do suffer a heavy defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. So know that Kasserine Pass was a defeat, and it's at that point that General Patton, is going to take charge, and the last of the German soldiers in North Africa would be surrendering by May of 1943. So over the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of action in North Africa, and really this is going to be a major launching off point for the invasion of Italy that you can see coming up here quite soon. Now, logistically, we don't often talk about the logistics of wars, and to get all of the men and supplies needed to fight this, they're having to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And we talked in the First World War about how the advanced German Navy sinking ships was a major issue. In fact, it's partly what drug us into the war with the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, fast forward to World War II, and we're having similar issues that German submarines are continuing to sink American vessels, especially merchant vessels. And so we had this major issue of all of our supplies being sunk by these German submarines. FDR is going to institute what becomes known as the convoy system. Okay, so a convoy, if you've ever traveled with, maybe a group of family in a convoy where you have multiple cars riding in a row, this was our answer to the German attacks on our vessels. Beginning in August of 1942, by that point, by the way, there had been about 360 American ships that had been sank by German submarines. So the U.S. is going to institute a system in 1942 in which all merchant vessels, so vessels carrying weapons or food or all those supplies created being traded through the Lend-Lease Act, we are going to put into effect a convoy system to where U.S. Navy is going to be escorting those merchant vessels to try and limit the number that are being attacked and sank. And it works. It works practically overnight, where submarines, when they're faced with, the choice of sinking a merchant ship that's being escorted by a destroyer, they're not going to take that risk. So we see attacks on U.S. merchant ships drop drastically overnight. And this enables us to get the supplies to Europe and the manpower to Europe as necessary. Moving down to the Italian campaign, after we retake North Africa from the Germans, the Allies are going to prepare an invasion of Italy. Italy was by far the weaker of the two Axis powers. And frankly, by this point, especially once the war does begin in Italy, the Italian people are quite, they're growing quite restless with Mussolini's leadership. They did not necessarily like this alliance with Germany in the first place, and now that the war is coming to them and they start dying, we're going to see some major political impacts in Italy. But the Italian campaign, when we launch this invasion, the Italian people actually they strip Mussolini of power in July 1943. And for Hitler, this is a shocking moment because, by this point he is fully in to Operation Barbarossa, and I mean they're fighting off the Russians to the east. But now all of a sudden you got the Americans coming in from the south, and the Italians are basically looking like they're about to wave the white flag. Hitler himself is going to send Nazi, the Wehrmacht, and they're going to send the German army into Italy, reinstate Mussolini's power to him. And so, Hitler's having to extend his control throughout Italy. The major battle I would like you to know of the Italian campaign, and sadly we don't have time to do this complete justice and talk about all of the heroics in this campaign, but the major battle that I would like you to know about is the Battle of Anzio. The Battle of Anzio lasted for 4 months. It was a long battle, and was one of our deadliest during the war. You had 25,000 Allied casualties, or excuse me, dead, not necessarily casualties, but actual killed in action. 25,000 Allied, and it left 30,000 Axis soldiers dead. After the U.S. and the Allies are able to defeat the Italians and Germans at the Battle of Anzio, they will try to, Mussolini will actually try to escape. He tries to flee into Germany for safety. And the story goes that he actually fled using, he was trying to use public transportation. He dressed up as a Nazi soldier, was wearing a uniform, and just tried to sneak across the border. The Italian people noticed him right away. I mean, they knew who this guy was. I mean, his face is literally everywhere. And the people of Italy, once they realized what was happening, they actually dragged Mussolini into the streets, executed him there in the streets, hung his body off of a bridge, and including his romantic partner was caught up in this as well. Both of them are beaten in the streets, and they are hung. So Mussolini would not live to see the end of the war, and he is killed by his own people. So things are not going well for the Axis powers in Italy, and we are continuing to make our way north. Now, this will lead to, as Hitler's focusing more on the south and the east, this will pave the way for an opportunity in the west. We have the largest amphibious assault in world history takes place in what is known as D-Day on June 6, 1944. And guys, I will remind you, I don't have you memorize too many dates. There are 2 dates I would like you to know for your unit test, and I think this is a very important one given the tremendous loss of life for the Americans during this battle. But the invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day, I would like you to know it took place on June 6, 1944. The invasion began with parachutes, parachuting soldiers, paratroopers behind enemy lines. The Germans had secured a lot of the beachheads. I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom right map at this point, where you can see the invasion taking place. You'll notice on the left side of that map, the first phase of what was called Operation Overlord. This invasion of Europe. You can see that the paratroopers were coming in from the west, and they were trying to basically get behind enemy lines before the main invasion began. I would also like to note that there was one of my favorite stories about this. There was a lot of trickery that was used to try and throw the Germans off. They knew that an invasion most likely was coming. The Allies did a great job of confusing the Germans. I've heard multiple stories. Number one, in fact, I've seen video of this. If we were in class together, I would show you this. But one thing that we did to actually get the Germans to believe an attack was coming elsewhere was as we were amassing our troops in southern England, one thing we did was tried to draw their attention to the eastern side. We knew that Germans were flying reconnaissance planes over the southern part of England, and so we actually created a balloon army. big inflatable tanks. These were life-size inflatable tanks. They were not real tanks. They're basically balloons, but painted to look like tanks. But think about it. If you are looking at this from the skies, you probably don't know the difference. But in reality, you could walk up to them and kick them, and they would just topple over. Now, if you're a German reconnaissance pilot and you're flying over and you look down and you see on the eastern side of England, you see 200 tanks assembled there along the eastern shoreline. You may report back, listen, the invasion's coming and it's coming from the east here. The most likely spot in that case would then be someplace like Belgium or the Netherlands. So the Germans were actually concentrating more forces in that area because the area that we are going to attack, Normandy, France, was actually further away than that part of France and the lower countries. Another, I guess, piece of trickery that we used against the Germans was I've read about planes being flown that were basically empty. They didn't have a lot of soldiers on them, but they did carry thousands of tons of scrap metal. And as they flew over the English Channel, they pushed that metal into the air. Well, by this point, the Germans have developed their own radar system, and when they're seeing their radar blips on the screen, and all of a sudden it looks like all this metal is in the air. They can't tell if that is actually planes or scrap metal as it actually was. So once again, trying to draw their attention elsewhere. I tell you these stories because I want you to understand that war encompasses so many different areas. It's not just the fighting on the ground. It's trying to get your enemy to think that you're doing something different. So much of this is based off of intelligence. And so the Germans are starting to amass further on the north and leaving Normandy. I won't say wide open because they still had major defenses there, and there's still going to be a tremendous loss of life because of D-Day. But June 6th, we'll get to the actual D-Day itself here. The invasion began with those parachuting troops behind enemy lines, and they were trying to attempt to clear out some of those defenses before the main troops landed. I said amphibious assault. So they are taking off from England. They're crossing the English Channel on vessels, and then they are landing on the beaches, and they're facing machine gun fire. I mean, the Germans have pillboxes up on the coastline, and they are the Americans, and I should say the British and the Canadians are also a part of this. If you look at that map on the lower right, you can see that we divided up the beachhead in Normandy, France, and you can see that the U.S. was responsible for 2 of them. If you've ever heard of Omaha Beach, Utah Beach. These were the beachheads that the U.S. was responsible for. The British, the Canadians, they were responsible for others, codename Juno and Sword, and there were numerous others. But all told, 156,000 troops are going to launch the largest land, sea, and air assault in human history. And it is successful, not after a tremendous loss of life, but it is successful, and this will begin the liberation of France, and this will also begin our push towards Germany. Now, that did not mean that everything was going to be clear sailing from here on out. I'd like you to take a look at the map that I've just put on the screen here. So notice you have Normandy up there. Really, the beach is not taken, or at least the coastline not fully secured there until June 25th. But we are able to liberate Paris a couple months later, and we do begin pushing in that way. You can see on the other side of the continent, the Soviet Union is starting to put some pressure on the Germans. By mid-1943, they are also pushing into Eastern Europe and liberating Poland, and they are making their way into Germany. This is a coordinated attack. We are working with the Soviet Union at this time to try and invade Germany at roughly the same period, so that way the Germans aren't able to fully focus on one area over the other. One foreshadowing that I do want to mention, since this map is up, look at the areas that the Soviet Union is invading in Eastern Europe. After this war comes to an end, where the U.S. forces, for the most part, we withdraw, those nations that have been liberated, for the most part, become allies, especially after the Marshall Plan. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union will not leave. okay? This is setting up the stage for the next 50 years of our history, because the Soviet Union will set up satellite states in all these nations that are loyal to Moscow. And if those satellite states do not adhere to the message of Moscow, the policies of Moscow, we will see that the Soviet Union is not afraid to enforce those policies. And we're going to see tanks in the streets in Eastern Europe. And this will be the beginning of what's called the Iron Curtain. So right here, this map, tells us a lot about the story of World War II, but it also foreshadows what is coming with the Cold War. And sadly, we knew that right after World War II ended, we got rid of the Nazi threat, but the Soviet threat would quickly replace that. So let's move on and talk about, again, I kind of transitioned here by saying not exactly smooth sailing. For the even after the invasion, one of the worst mistakes that was made was called Operation Market Garden, and this was the largest airborne assault in World War II. The Allies were trying to access northern Germany by launching basically an assault kind of behind enemy lines using paratroopers. It failed logistically because there were a lot of things that went wrong. Number one, the weather played a key factor. It was extremely windy when this operation was launched, and they decided to go with it anyways. Well, sure, the soldiers may land, but what happens when you land and you're 5 miles away from, the bridge that you're supposed to destroy or, secure? So what happens in Operation Market Garden is you have this mass slaughter and mass confusion. These guys get stuck basically behind enemy lines, and frankly, they get slaughtered. The Battle of the Bulge, January of 1945. I want you to know that this is the turning point in Europe, okay? Know that January 1945, this is when the Germans are no longer attempting to just defend their border. They're going to be starting to hightail it back to Germany. Just like the Battle of Midway is the turning point in the Pacific, the Battle of the Bulge is the turning point in Europe. That will be on the test, so please understand that. Well, first of all, what was the Battle of the Bulge and why was it called this? Imagine a defensive line, running north and south. If the Germans are expected to try and defend all that area, they decided to try and divide and conquer. Right, that has been a military strategy from literally the beginning of time. If you can divide the enemy force, you can separate them out. They become 50% as powerful. That's what the Germans try to do here. They try to push their way through our offensive line that is coming towards them, and they try to create a bulge in that line, trying to break through and separate out the Allied forces. It does not work. And in fact, this would be one of the largest losses of German lives and machinery as well. The Germans, in this last-ditch effort, they would lose 120,000 men in the Battle of the Bulge. 120,000 men in this one battle. They will also lose 600 tanks. That is the bulk of their remaining tanks at this point. So, when I said that Germans are going to start kind of hightailing it back to Germany, I mean, in a lot of ways, the war's kind of lost at this point, but they are going to fight to defend their homeland. And from this point on, we're going to be fighting some very tough battles. The next major event, as you can see there, is that in 1945, and this would be the last year of the war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, does die. He had recently won his fourth presidential campaign. He had not been inaugurated, but he will die of natural causes. He was becoming quite old at this point, quite frail. And now we have a new leader for the United States, and that is hometown boy, Harry S. Truman. So we've talked about Truman, and for anybody watching this outside the class, right now we are in Kansas City, Missouri. Truman is from Kansas City, so a lot of my students know a lot of history about him. But Truman does become president. Shockingly, people are not. Nobody thought that Truman would serve as president, and they especially wouldn't think that he would be reelected or elected the first time after the war. But Truman will be the one to make decisions from here on out. And he has some very tough decisions to make, especially in the Pacific theater with the upcoming usage of the atomic bombs. Let's wrap it up with the Battle of Berlin, and this would be the last major battle of the European campaign. And notice that it is the Soviet Union that is making the push into Berlin. May of 1945, the German forces have really been forced all the way back to the capital of Berlin. The Soviets have completely surrounded that city. Hitler has taken refuge in an underground bunker, and alongside not only his longtime girlfriend, who he actually marries in the underground bunker, named Eva Braun, but also the higher levels of the Nazi leadership are also in this underground bunker with him as the Soviet Union is starting to take parts of the city above. As Hitler understands the game is up, even though he is ordering his men selfishly, completely selfishly, which would you expect anything else? He orders his men to fight to the death, even though the game is up, and he cowardly takes his own life in this underground bunker. He takes cyanide, and from what documents we've seen, also commits suicide by shooting himself in the head. Many of the other Nazi command will also commit suicide in this bunker, escaping any kind of justice. The worst story I know of is what Joseph Goebbels does. We have not mentioned Goebbels as much. He was the minister of propaganda for the Nazis, and Goebbels was there with his rather large family. They were all living in the bunker. I believe he had at least 7 children. I could be wrong on that number. He will actually feed all of his family cyanide, killing his entire family before killing himself. Above ground, the Soviets eventually do take the city at a very high cost of life. And with Hitler gone, with the capital being captured, officially this does begin to mark the end of the war in Europe. And this becomes known as Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, on May 8th, 1945. In the following days, the Nazis would surrender unconditionally. And what that means is they give up completely without putting any conditions. Like, we'll quit, but we want to keep, the Nazis in control of the government, or we want to keep, Czechoslovakia as a part of, or Poland as a part of the Third Reich. Unconditional. We give up, and they basically there was nothing they could do at this point. So the war does come to an end in May of 1945, but I will remind you that the war is raging still in the Pacific theater, and it was not a foregone conclusion that fighting would end anytime soon. The island hopping campaign had continued, but if anything, the Japanese are proving to be more virulent, and they are not giving up easily. So next time we meet, we will talk about the decisions that had to be made on how to bring about a war to the war to an end in the Pacific. And one of the most difficult decisions that any president in history has ever had to make, and that is whether or not to drop the most powerful and destructive weapon in human history. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. As always, please email me if you have any questions. Leave comments below in the video. I'd be happy to get back to any. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.